First of all, thank you, all of the organizers here, for including me in this. I haven't been back to the DSPT for a few years, and it really is a joy to be able to be with you and learn from you. I'm having a little bit of cultural whiplash right now in that my primary energies have been going into having Socratic discussions with undergraduates about great texts from the ancient Greeks and Romans and medieval period, etc. On the other hand, I have had one foot in the nonprofit charitable sector for about 25 years now, so I'm kind of shifting weight from one to the other, but I find that they do converge. The disciplines of one can apply to the other. I started my career with an academic phase of it and then moved to public policy, went to Washington, concluded that perhaps government doesn't have all the answers, then an international chapter of reporting about events in Europe up to the time of the fall of the wall, entered a charitable sector there, then writing, 5 books later resurfaced, moved back to the United States and began this journey kind of in 2 places, one in the inner city and the other in the academy. Interesting, that's all I can say. God had a really unanticipated plan for me. When I came back to the States in '95, I was praying, Lord, what next? I have 2 kids to support, and it's a little unclear where I'm supposed to land. And he said very specifically to answer, I don't always get these answers like this, but this was very clear. Go into the inner cities of America, find the people doing my work, write about them, speak about them, be their friend, be their advocate, and be a bridge between the people who have resources and those who need them. And I'm thinking to myself, right, Barbara in the hood. I mean, it's not my natural habitat, but I have had such an incredible ride since, finding these unsung heroes, the street saints, the people who are doing the difficult job of scooping up human beings and loving them into wholeness. And along the way, I was given the opportunity to help nurture their strength, find out what it is they're doing, why does it work, can you document their success, plant models that then work. So putting these disciplines together, I'm looking at charity, but also with an eye to the historical roots and to the theological roots and to the practical effects, social entrepreneurism. There have been several mentors along the way who I think are kind of the gold standard in finding a way into this field. One of them was Marvin Olasky. He wrote a book called The Tragedy of American Compassion, and he was quite rigorous in finding out exactly what was it that Americans were doing at the time of the founding. What was it that Americans were doing and caring for one another at the time that de Tocqueville visited America, for example. And he found hundreds and hundreds of little thriving, what Tocqueville called private voluntary associations, to care for everything from widows to orphans to what he delicately called women of fallen honor. You get the idea. Anyway, children, people who were in poverty, whatever it might be. And wherever there was a community, there were people who were helping extend a hand, but not to give a handout, but to give what Marvin Olasky then dubbed a hand up. And he was saying that we have essentially abandoned part of the initial mission in that we have asked too little of those who are providing charitable care. He's saying that the initial Americans, after the founding here, had a category of what they called the worthy poor. This was not somebody who was simply a drunk lounging in the town square expecting a handout. These were people who had a hardship and for a time needed to be lifted up. Well, Olasky then applied this to what we were doing in America now, and he sat me down and gave me a tutorial at his needs and then said, go forth, my child, and write. The watchword for him was effective compassion. Is an organization doing enough to actually transform the life of the person that they are serving? Because if they're not, it's not enough. We're not asking enough of the recipient to participate in their own rehabilitation, the object being to lift them to their feet and then let them go and be self-sufficient or active and productive people in the community. The second mentor that I had who made an imprint was Peter Drucker. And he had a category of establishing whether or not a nonprofit would be effective by taking them through 5 simple questions. Most of you know about Peter Drucker, I'm guessing, at least people in the business community, but he asked the same questions of nonprofits. What is your mission? Who do you serve? What do those people value? How do you evaluate your results, and what's your plan? And I've now taken lots and lots and lots of nonprofits through that, and it's extraordinary what unfolds along the way to clarify mission and to try to run nonprofits a little bit more like businesses in the sense that there is accountability. The profit motive is different, but if the end is transform human lives, that is a commodity, and you can actually see the health of people coming through on the other side. Along the way, I discovered that there is a spectrum of faith-based organizations, everything from faith-founded, and then it becomes faith-silent. That would apply to most of the universities from the time of the founding in this country. Then there's the faith-optional model. You can go to chapel on Wednesday if you want to, but you don't have to. Then there's the faith-integrated model, which is you have to have a certain number of credits of theology and philosophy before we let you out of here, but what you do with it is your own business. And then there is the faith-saturated model. And for a nonprofit, that means you are going to hear about Jesus Christ every day. You are going to have people praying for you and with you. And our goal for you will be to have not only your material needs met, but your spiritual needs as well. Now that's getting to be risky business. But I also found that the people who take the faith-saturated approach were producing more actually transformed people than the other models were. So if you take this approach into the inner city, you can see a whole variety of attempts to alleviate poverty, going all the way back, well, I don't know where you want to pick it in history. You can pick the communist model, you can pick the Great Society, you can pick the effective compassion in the Bush administration. The real important question underlying these is that they are built on competing views of man. If you attempt to only solve the material problem, you are assuming that man is only material and that that will meet all that's necessary. If, on the other hand, you believe that man is a spiritual being, any remedy for a malady would have to take that into account, maybe even focus on that above other things. In other words, I found the same thing from academic analysis that I found from one of the street saints. Freddie Garcia had a ministry in San Antonio. He was a former heroin addict himself, and then later ran a center to help other people leave drugs. He said, quite provocatively, but he could get away with it because of his history, he said, the problem is not drugs. He said, drugs are the symptom. Sin is the problem, and Jesus Christ is the answer. Well, that's bold stuff. On the other hand, 90% of the people who came to his center emerged a year later transformed human beings. So something seemed to be going on in terms of the spirit. One of the major discoveries I made along the way is that the at-risk population in the inner city has multiple obstacles. It's not just a lack of money. That would be far too easy. There is a total breakdown of the institutions that should equip youngsters for life. The family has fallen into disrepair, and the presence of faith in those places has proven to have an effect, but not enough to overcome all of the other obstacles, education. So the mediators of civilization, if you will, have proven to be more and more scarce. So you go into the inner city today, 72% of the children born to African American mothers are being born to single mothers. There is an absence of fathers that is across the landscape, at least 2 generations deep. Instead, we have baby daddies, and I've talked to kids who could say, well, that's the baby daddy for this one of my sisters and brothers, and that's the baby daddy for that one. But marriage is not a common thing to find in the inner city. 53% of the Hispanics are having children out of wedlock now, and 66% of the Native Americans. This is an immoral indictment. I'm saying culturally, it makes it impossible to pass on civilization. A single mother has her hands full just trying to work 2 near minimum wage jobs to keep food on the table. It's an impossible situation. But what happens is that the children of unmarried mothers are, statistically speaking, much more likely to use drugs. They are more likely to do poorly in school. And by the way, the Catholic Church is pulling out of the inner cities. That was the last front, if you will, for civilization. Children like this are also more likely to end up in prison themselves and have their own children out of wedlock. Now, the men in the inner city, many of them that I've encountered, are caught in this crossfire. So they're caught in inadequate schooling. They turn to the one lucrative form of business, which is drug trafficking. If you're a 10-year-old kid and you can earn $300 a day just for running a little bag across a park, that's pretty good money in the inner city, and it's very hard to resist that. So the men who are there are in this cycle. So there is lack of education, so they turn to using drugs and often to selling it. Then they're arrested and put into prison. And then when they get out eventually, the only people they know are in that neighborhood again, and the only marketable skill they have is in drug trafficking, and they do the one rational thing, which is to go back to that. So you have this cycle of incarceration and then coming out again, still the same lack of skills, and by the way, try applying for a job if you check the felony box in your application, not so easy. So we end up with this cycle, and it is almost impossible to get out of it on their own. So far, no one has found a really good solution to address all of those issues at once. Another one of my mentors that I encountered along the way is a man named Bob Woodson. He is African American. He did sociological studies. He got the Genius MacArthur Award, but he specialized in going into the inner city and finding what he called the grassroots leaders. And he understands something that I've learned the hard way, is that you can't go into a plan into a neighborhood and expect other people to get on board with your vision. The only intelligent thing to do, Bob Woodson says, is ask them what they think they need and find the people who live in that neighborhood to actually then lead the efforts to bring together neighbors into a sense of community and accomplish what they have self-identified as necessary. Well, that's a risky thing to try too. Another one along the way that I met, who I would highly recommend, Byron Johnson, began to do sociological studies on what he called the faith factor. So we have the premise that, of course, people of faith would have a better life. Well, is that statistically verifiable? And the answer is yes. Byron Johnson found, for example, that teenage males in the inner city who attend church at least once a week, maybe twice, and who self-identify as praying at least once a day, are insulated from the effects of their neighborhood that otherwise would lead them into drugs, gangs, etc. There is a verifiable faith factor that in a sense insulates these young people from the deleterious influences around them. Well, that's interesting stuff. So if you then begin to look at the programs that are actually having an impact, to what extent do they have the faith factor integrated into their model? Well, what happens is that there are a variety of attempts, and one of the pastors I talked to in an African American community told me this. There are essentially three kinds of involvement. They're concentric circles. So the outer ring of the concentric circle is stuff. It's money, it's books, it's backpacks, it's whatever it might be. You're dropping off the things that then the ministry can use. And they're good, don't get me wrong. It's good and it's necessary, but there's more. He said the next ring inside is then a one-time event where you actually have a face-to-face encounter with someone, bringing a Thanksgiving turkey and then celebrating the holiday with them, building a Habitat for Humanity house and then talking to the person who's going to be moving into it. But then at the end of the day, everyone goes home and you've had an encounter. Even just a one-day encounter is a better thing, says his pastor, than simply dropping things off. But he said the sweet spot, the really great one, the middle of the target, the bullseye, is a sustained relationship over time with the person whose name you know, and with a relationship of accountability. Much more difficult. If you take on, say, a first grader that you're going to mentor and you promise to be there every week for the entire year, you better show up if you've made that promise. But if you do, that relationship transforms a child who doesn't otherwise have anybody reliable in their life. It also accomplishes something that no social program can, no government program can. It uses the medium of love. And love ends up being mutually transforming. It's not only the object of our affections, we find that so much more is taking place in us. And one of the difficulties of looking to the government to solve some of our problems is that the government cannot love. That is the one thing that only the people of God can and should be giving when they are attempting to rehabilitate or spark regrowth in the inner city. Well, after I had studied a great deal of this, I wrote a book about it called Street Saints, wrote another one for philanthropists called Equipping the Saints, and after speaking, and I think I stopped counting after 50, but I think it was almost 60 cities around the country, I came back to Houston and I said, I want to take some of what I've learned and all these amazing, remarkable people and plant it here. So I did my Nehemiah march around the city of Houston. Said, okay, where is the wall down? And we have a very robust nonprofit sector, faith-based groups. This is a buckle of the Bible Belt, so I mean, there are a lot of very well-intended and very active people. But the one place where the homeless shelters stopped or the prison programs stopped was the last piece, which is always implicitly, now go get a job. Well, if you have 4 felonies and you've spent 15 years in prison, yeah, good luck. So I was able to convince, with a kind of a mutual partnership with a number of them, that what we needed to have was an organization that focused on that, specifically on the job piece of it, and put together a program. It looks easy at the beginning. It's a job readiness workshop, 8 days. You think, 8 days of your life, what's that? But actually, there's more. If you do the workshop, then there are 3 months. You get a job search coach who will walk with you personally for as long as it takes. And then if you can stay on one job for 1 year, we have somebody who will help you advance out of the $10.50 an hour job that you have and actually get a little bit higher on the rung, get benefits, and pull your life together. Well, the interesting thing with that is that it is much more successful than we ever could have imagined. And I attribute all of the effectiveness to the fact that it is faith-saturated. God does what man cannot do. The results are this. Now, 10 years later, we've graduated almost 4,000 people, and about 72% of them right now are working today. Now, 60% of these folks had felonies in their background, so I'm not talking about an easy-to-place group, but we also have, college kids who didn't get a job after the first year and then after the second year and have kind of fallen off the radar. All kinds of people who were outsourced, who were downsized, who lost their jobs for a variety. So 40% of our people are what I call more mainstream, but just as devastated. I mean, the absence of work is crippling for the human mind and psyche. Well, one of the reasons that we know we're doing well is that the government counterpart to what we're doing sends us the hard cases they can't do anything with. That's a kind of a success that we are pretty happy about. But the question I think that goes underneath this is, whose job is it to care for the poor? We've operated more recently under the assumption that that is the government's job, but the government can't do it well. And the sad truth is that on the nonprofit sector, with all of these little ragtag groups everywhere, they're impossible to organize in a huge initiative. And they're always scrambling for funds, and they're run on a shoestring and prayer and duct tape. Now, something has to happen to make that different. If you go back to Democracy in America, Alexis de Tocqueville, he saw 2 tendencies in America that make this problem even more acute now. He saw, on the one hand, the tendency toward founding organizations, grassroots kinds of things, which would then be helpful. He said, on the other hand, there is a tendency for Americans to become more materially oriented, to retreat into their own little corner, Tocqueville's words, and to simply have less and less to do with the people around them and just not care. And Tocqueville said, as long as these 2 impulses are balancing each other, the soul of America will remain relatively healthy. He said the minute it tips over toward the material and toward individualism and isolation, the soul of America will become sick. And I think we have probably come to that place. So the answer is building bridges that are then authentic, having the kind of rigor in what we're doing to be accountable, to love people into wholeness, and to give them an opportunity to become all that God intended them to be by not setting the bar too low. And the things that happen, one of the things that happens along the way is that there is this mutual transformation that no one can plan, but we can observe. We celebrate the 8-day workshop with a graduation at the end, and a number of the graduates get up and talk a little bit about their history. And one of them, 3 years ago, Michael Richardson, told us a story. He had lived on the streets all of his life. He was a drug addict. He'd been imprisoned many times. His parents had also lived on the street and also were addicts. So we have 2 generations here. Now, I've seen a lot of people in the inner city at this point, and I'm not too easily intimidated. Michael Richardson was scary. He had scars all over his body, open sores, missing teeth, and a mean demeanor. But somebody had found him under a bridge, convinced him to go to one of the shelters in Houston, and they, in turn, a couple months later, convinced him to come to the WorkFaith Connection. And he got up that Friday and he said, I've lived like an animal all my life. I didn't learn to read until I was 45 years old. Everything I know, I learned from people on the street or in prison. But he said, this Thursday here, I found my dignity because you loved me. A lot of us teared up at that moment, but the thing I loved almost the best about it is when he said, because you loved me. He didn't mean me personally. He meant the people on the staff who had been doing it. And that was, for me, the affirmation, I don't have to be there to make it work. They understand how powerful it is to love a person into wholeness with Christ loving through them. And if that could reach Michael Richardson, it can reach anyone. I'll simply close with this. We have this idea that there are the down and outers. Okay, these are the homeless people, these are drug addicts, these are people in and out of prison. Clear to identify. The up and outers, however, are a very interesting subcategory of Americans as well. The up and outers may have more education, they have more PhDs, they drive a BMW, at least they have a car, a whole variety of things. But if you look just this much under the surface, you will find that there are broken marriages, there is alcohol abuse, there's abuse of prescription drugs, there are kids getting into all kinds of bizarre things that we have no idea what they're doing on the internet. And all of a sudden, the people who are now coming to volunteer, we've had thousands of them, the people who were the up and outers kind of come down a couple notches when they're trying to lift the down and outers up, but the down and outers then can legitimately stand up because their dignity has been affirmed. Someone took the time and the effort to love them into wholeness. And you get the up and outers and the down and outers, and we've discovered that we need the same things. Every single one of us needs a place to live. We need people around us to love us. We need connection with family. But most of all, we need love. And that's where the down and outers and the up and outers converge. And we meet at the foot of the cross. That is where the charitable efforts should all be focused. It's where we personally can engage in a meaningful way, not necessarily because we can solve all the social ills. We can't. But because we're being obedient to what God is calling us to do, and that is to love one another as He has loved us. Thank you.